Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday's thought for the day. Excuse me. You know, I love to bake bread. Baking bread has often been a saving grace to me when I've been going through major depression, and it gives me time to focus on a creative process that's also practical and sustaining and, dare I say, spiritual. And I've baked different breads over the years, from a basic white loaf to sourdough bread and no knead bread and things, Italian breads like focaccia and ciabatta, among others. And I love the process. I love the process because it's so simple, or it appears so simple. It relies on fermentation. That's an ancient, possibly billions of years old process that's common to all bacteria. And I think the thing that really connects me to bread as well is, again, it's a childhood thing. My grandmother was a professional bread maker. She had a bread shop originally in Hull in Yorkshire. And when she moved down to Wolverhampton after being bombed out in the Second World War, she had a bread shop in Heath Town. Now, I don't remember the bread shops. I wasn't born for the first one, and the second one I was too young. But I do remember her always baking bread at home, when she would fill a huge bowl with kneaded dough and she'd put it before the fire to rise, or near the fire. And I remember sitting in the warmth watching the bread rise, and I thought it was a magical process. And the combination of the warmth of the fire and the smell of the yeast and the rising of the dough was a heady mix. And in my last church, I was inspired by a project in Liverpool that's actually spread around the country now, different churches, but it was called the Bread Church, and this was a church in Hope Street in Liverpool that created church around baking bread. And it was based in an area of high poverty and homelessness and problems of alcoholism and drug addiction. And people who wouldn't normally get involved with church would come and were helped to bake their own bread, usually 2 loaves, one of which they were encouraged to give away. And the bread baking process allowed for people to connect, to socialize, to reflect and learn, reflect on faith and pray and celebrate. And I copied this model at my previous church. One day a week I would have people come in, regulars come in, all quite a mixture of people. You know, there were hopeless people, there were people who had serious problems, who had little confidence and so on. And we copied this model, and they came in to make their own loaves. I showed them how to mix and knead, and we didn't have the facilities within the building that we had. We had just an ordinary oven that couldn't take the amount of loaves that were made. So we asked a local baker if he would put the loaves in the oven for us, and he kindly did so. And the conversations and the achievement felt by those taking part was, well, it was so rewarding to me to see that, to see people actually create something that they were proud of. People who might not always have thought that they could do things like that. And always they would like a photograph of the bread before they took it away and so on. And we even did it with a group of children who, rather than make a loaf of bread, actually made their own pizzas from scratch, and they loved doing it. It was quite messy with the children, but it's something that I would love to do again at some point. And traditionally, there are four ingredients that create bread: water, yeast, salt, and flour, which is usually wheat flour. And wheat, of course, must be grown and harvested and gathered. And then yeast is it's a living organism that's essential for the process of baking bread. And for thousands of years, bakers relied on the wild yeasts that live in the air and created starters which they maintained in order to rise their breads. And apparently it's rumoured that there are starters today that could be hundreds of years old, that are passed down from one family to another like precious heirlooms. And that's also the process for sourdough bread. You don't add yeast, you just use the natural yeasts in the air to create your sourdough bread. And yeast is activated by warm water. The yeast eats the sugar in the flour and then sort of sweat, and then it produces a gas as a result, and it's that gas that causes the bread to rise. And the sweat is what gives the bread flavour and aroma. That doesn't sound very mouth-watering, does it? In order to transform the flour, the yeast, the water and salt into a loaf, you must do everything to keep that yeast happy and alive until it's time to bake. And the yeast will continue to release that gas until it gets in the oven, where they reach a temperature that's too hot and they die. And somebody called, I don't know who this is, but I read this, somebody called Norman Wurzburg says that eating is a matter of life and death. And it's in the baking and the breaking of bread that we have an opportunity to experience that in a profound and spiritual way. Because wheat is alive until it's harvested and milled. The yeast die under a high heat. And the ingredients transform into something else completely. The bread that emerges from the oven is something that it wasn't before. It becomes bread. A food so substantial and nourishing that it can mean food itself. And by breaking and eating it, we're given life. In a practical sense, of course, but also spiritually. And in the Bible, bread is mentioned 492 times, beginning in Genesis and ending in Revelation, with a variety of meanings and symbolism. It's used to symbolize God's provision. Remember in Exodus when manna rained down? It represents life and salvation. Jesus himself calls himself the bread of life in the Gospel of John. In the time of Moses, 12 loaves of bread called showbread was offered to God as a form of thanksgiving for his constant care and presence. And of course we use bread in communion to represent Jesus' body. And there are many other things in the Bible that bread is used as a symbol of, and you might like to have a go at discovering them. And although bread can symbolize lots of things in the Bible, what it points at most is Jesus himself. He's the bread. He's the bread of life. We must all take in if we truly want to grow spiritually in him. And bread's such a simple thing and such a complex thing all at the same time. Think about it next time you eat it, or better still, get baking and prayerfully immerse yourself in the process. You will gain such a lot, I'm sure. Amen. Well, I'll speak to you next Monday. You take care, look after yourselves, and God bless. Bye-bye.